Speaking third is code 5086, answering the question, how can the Pacific Islands Forum address climate displacement?
Recently, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has been making a desperate attempt to court young voters. He's been doing this by using a lot of Gen Z slang. Like in a recent parliamentary address, he referred to the opposition as Delulu with no Salulu. And if you don't know what that means, then congratulations on not having a TikTok account. It translates, however, to delusional without a solution. And the Australian opposition isn't the only group that is delulu if it thinks it can get by without help from the Australian government. Because as the International Migration Association warns us just yesterday, climate change is ravaging the Pacific Islands. From Micronesia to Polynesia, sea levels are rising faster than double the global average, leaving the Pacific Islands Forum with a disaster on its hands. In fact, the Pacific Islands Forum itself tells us that 50,000 people are being displaced by climate change every single year, and over 48 million are expected to be displaced in the region by 2050. And it's when considering that currently an El Nino, a global storm system that heats ocean waters and causes sea levels to rise, is brewing, threatening to devastate the Pacific Islands. But also that the Pacific Islands' response to climate change is a vital blueprint for a problem that none of us can escape. It is high time that we ask the question, how can the Pacific Islands Forum address climate displacement? The answer is clear. It's by responding to key vulnerabilities. By first, offering emergency visas. Second, prioritizing the protection of cultural heritage, before finally improving emergency warning systems. Now, if you asked Anthony Albanese to describe how Pacific Islanders are currently treating their governments, he'd probably tell you that the governments are being ghosted because citizens are leaving their countries en masse, giving us the first way in which the Pacific Islands Forum can respond to climate displacement, and that is by offering emergency visas. The problem is explained to us by the Human Rights Watch in September of 2025, which notes that for those being displaced by flooding in the Pacific Islands, there is literally nowhere to go. In countries like Tuvalu, the entire country sits just a few feet above sea level, making none of it habitable. In fact, one resident of the Solomon Islands recently said to a reporter, "We are just out of land." Under normal circumstances, these people would file for refugee status and claim asylum in another country. However, the United Nations refugee protections only applies to those fleeing war or violence, not climate change. That's why the Pacific Islands Forum must act on its own. In particular, The Guardian implores in October of 2025 that countries in the Pacific Islands Forum that are more well-resourced, like Australia and New Zealand, must begin offering emergency visas to those fleeing climate displacement, so that people who don't have a home in the Solomon Islands or Tuvalu, in the interim, at least have somewhere to go if the UN won't come to their aid. Thankfully, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace told us this September that Australia and Tuvalu just struck a first-of-its-kind deal for mobility agreement, but that must be the first of many. Otherwise, Pacific Islanders will simply be left with nowhere to go. But second, as hard as us Gen Zers have worked to protect our slang, it seems to be adopted these days among the adults. I mean, it's just a matter of time before Scott One is talking about how auriful he is. But the second way in which Pacific Islands Forum can respond to climate displacement is by protecting cultural heritage. The problem is explained to us by Princeton University back in October, which highlights that 75% of the population in the Pacific Islands is made up of indigenous groups, whose sites have historically been desecrated and devastated by the international community. Now they're facing double devastation because these groups have historically sustained their cultures through oral traditions and ties to ancestral lands. As they're displaced by climate change, though, they're removed from those ancestral lands, and as people are scattered across the globe, they lose communication with the elders who know about ancestral traditions and languages. The problem has gotten so dire that today, 82% of indigenous languages in the Pacific Islands are considered endangered or dead. However, the Pacific Island Forum can act to save them. The Georgetown Journal of International Affairs highlights last December that the solution is as simple as the Pacific Island Forum sending delegations to as many islands in the region as possible with nothing but a voice recorder and a camera. Because if they do that, they can actually record ancestral lands and take down languages that people are currently speaking, therefore being able to create, for example, an online database in which people can access the languages that have sustained them for so long. The languages of Pacific Islanders have sustained the entire region for generations. It is time that we do our part in sustaining them. But finally, Gen Zers know a thing or two about red flags. If you're interested in learning more, just ask an LD debater. That's the final way, however, in which the Pacific Island Forum can act to address climate displacement by improving red flags or emergency warning systems. The problem is explained to us by the International Meteorological Association back in January of this year, where they highlight that for 60% of Pacific Islanders, they have no access to double hazard emergency warning systems. In other words, the territory they live in is not covered by infrastructure that would tell them when there's even a flood impending. That makes the impact of climate displacement that much worse. Because if you don't know to fortify your home, to repair your family, you're all the more likely to actually have to move to another country because you didn't know that a storm was brewing. And in the meantime, as the Pacific Islands Forum expands these double hazard warning systems, there is an effective shorter-term solution. In fact, Global Affairs tells us in an article published just 2 weeks ago that over 30% of Pacific Islanders don't have access to cell service. That means they can't doom scroll in the literal sense or in the more metaphorical sense of, learning about impending climate disasters. But the solution then is for the Pacific Islands Forum to transfer all 18 of its countries onto an existing cell service network. That way, people can at least get a notification when a storm is brewing and protect their families and their homes. Doing so would also allow them to safely move to Australia to finally teach Albanese the proper way to use Gen Z slang. Anthony Albanese is right that Pacific Islanders are delulu if they think they can get through the next couple years unscathed. That is why we ask the question, how can the Pacific Islands Forum address climate displacement? The answer is clear. They can respond to key vulnerabilities by, first, expanding access to the systems that will allow people to actually move to new countries, but second, by prioritizing the protection of cultural heritage before finally offering expanded emergency response systems. That way, Pacific Islanders can confidently say that they really do have a Salulu. Thank you.
Speaker number 3 will now be cross-examined by Speaker 2, code 5092.
Congratulations on a fantastic speech. As always, I just have a couple of questions. So let's get straight into it on your first point. A lot of international organizations, including the UN themselves, have recently made major moves to define climate refugees as a form of refugee. So why do these Pacific organizations have to do it themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would actually refer you back to your own question, which is that the UN is making major moves, but it hasn't codified these definitions yet. Sea levels are rising right now, and El Nino is brewing today. Pacific Islands don't have time to wait, so they need to rely on their neighbors. That's exactly why Australia and New Zealand have to start offering these emergency visas. We can't wait until the next disaster and hope that the UN steps in.
Okay, but if the United Nations doesn't protect these refugees, then why would other countries accept them? We've seen in countries like the United States, for example, that were very harsh on immigration in the status quo.
That's a great question. Both Australia and New Zealand are both currently facing declining economic growth thanks to a labor shortage. That means that they actually have a massive incentive to welcome refugees that could help address that problem.
Okay, let's move on to your second point. If all that it takes is a recorder in order to preserve these precious cultural memories, then how come in the status quo, as you explained, 80% of languages are going extinct?
That's because the Pacific Islands Forum hasn't acted yet. That's exactly why I give you the solution. They haven't taken the steps to record these languages, which is why we need to do it now. The fact of the matter is that it's a Herculean logistical task to do so, but it's one that the Pacific Islands Forum is up to. Now is the time to protect the languages that have for so long protected all of us.
Okay, let's move on to your final point. What good are early warning systems if people don't have a way to necessarily flee the country in the necessary amount of time?
Well, they're valuable because people can fortify their homes. If you know a storm is coming, you'll stockpile resources, create protections. That way, even if you don't have somewhere to go, you have a path to survival. But also, I point you back to my first point, which is that if the Pacific Islands Forum offers these emergency visas, then people actually will have somewhere to go.
I believe that's time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Congratulations again.